An old adage says that it's possible to win the battle, but lose the war. And when we look at what's happening now, it does seem that Russia might be winning the war. The difference is when we talk about the war, we're referring to the war in Ukraine. In that, Russia's not advancing. Things are going very badly for Russia. But that's not how Russia defines the war. Rather, Russia looks at what is going on globally, how it's acting across multiple continents as being the war. Ukraine certainly is an important aspect of that war, but in the eyes of the Kremlin, that's just one battle. And the tragedy, Western leaders have not paid attention to what Russia is doing and seeking to do globally, thinking that it's all about Ukraine. But it's not. Russia has designs to do much, much more globally to hurt the West and to damage our ability to have a stable world order. So, as others have said before, in the eyes of Putin, what is occurring now is not even World War III. It's perhaps World War IV. The argument being that the final collapse of the Soviet Union and the Cold War was already World War III. And this stage of the war is global. Again, in the eyes of Vladimir Putin, as he's repeated multiple times, Russia is at war with NATO. But once again, Russia's wise enough to know that an actual hot war, a conventional war with NATO would be disastrous. Russia would get destroyed quickly. And as we've seen since they started invading Ukraine, Russia has very few allies that are willing to stick their neck out for them. So Russia has realized that the only way that it can really influence global events is by doing something different, because conventional war would be disastrous. Hence, while we look at what is happening now, we could see the fingerprints of asymmetrical warfare or hybrid warfare that Russia is waging. Just in the recent elections in Georgia and Moldova, we saw that Russia was able to effectively try to influence the outcomes. And in both cases, we see that Russia has been able to cover their tracks pretty well. So why does Russia feel so empowered to be able to just influence the elections across the former Soviet states? Well, besides just the historic colonialism of Russia, which sees no problem in interfering in the politics at the local level of the former Soviet republics, there's another side. Russia has realized that it's very cheap and pretty effective to interfere in elections. And by doing that, it'll save a lot of time in the long run. Having to send in soldiers or threaten to invade countries is a lot of work and a lot of money and a lot of time. Much more effective is if you control the legislature or the presidency of countries which you would like to have. But we also see in this that Russia feels that it has a free hand to do what it wants. And it's sort of shocking when you consider the fact that Russia is under more sanctions than any other country in history. But why does Russia feel empowered? Or what evidence do we see that Russia, not having been punished for passing over one red line after another, is having global effects? Well, the most clear one in the recent weeks has been North Korea's decision to assist Russia. North Korea now is sending not only weapons and ammo, but also soldiers to Russia. Imagine, North Korea is so unafraid of the West red lines that it's helping to invade a country in Europe. But that's not all. Throughout this war, we've seen that Iran has been able to help Russia in a multitude of ways, including with drones and other technological assistance. But Iran also plays a critical role in helping to wash money globally and helping Russia to continue receiving financing and to transfer money, despite the fact that the world sanctions are all on top of Moscow. Fortunately for everyone, Iran's poor decision to work with terrorists caught up with it, as we've seen that Hezbollah's leadership has been wiped out. That's a positive thing. Keep in mind, Hezbollah and Hamas maintain very good relationships with Moscow. So that's certainly a setback in the eyes of Russia, but there's other areas where they see that things are going well. Now, in Europe, we see Russia's success with some politicians, such as in Slovakia and in Hungary, where the governments there have openly pro-Russian viewpoints and are doing things that are detrimental to the security of Europe. But it's not only in Europe that Russia has been able to find friends. We've seen that Russia is trying to directly, again, influence the American presidential elections, which are soon to be held. Russia's objective, again, is to do what it does in every democratic country, to try and influence the voters to vote for candidates who are going to be detrimental to that country's national security interest, but who would be good for the security interest of Russia. In the case of Africa, we've seen that Russia has faced very little resistance as it's helped to overthrow multiple countries' leaderships in the recent past. In Africa, Russia has shown us very clearly what their interests are. In the recent coups that were organized by Moscow, we see that the Wagner Group and associated organizations have showed up. And the first thing they do is always the same. They're not interested in peace building or improving the countries to which they've arrived. Rather, they're interested in finding out how they can have a monopoly over those countries' natural resources. Now, it's known that China, a close ally of Russia, obviously has its own objectives in Africa and Latin America. But China at least uses softer approaches, economic approaches, which are detrimental for those countries, but bloodless. In the case of Russia, the use of murder, rape, and torture remains very common as they seek to subdue local populations and take as many assets as possible. In the case of Latin America, it's probably no surprise, there's been a huge surge of illegal immigrants seeking to enter the United States coming from countries that are affiliated with Russia, including Venezuela. And why is that? Well, Venezuela, like its friend Nicaragua, is keen to be sending people out, sending them north before the presidential elections, which then spurs a rise in American nationalism, which then inspires a rise in voting for candidates who promise to deport the immigrants. Keep in mind, there's one political party that Russia is thinking about. We've seen how Russia is able to effectively use migrants all over Europe, such as we saw on the Polish border with Belarus and we saw on the Lithuanian border with Belarus. We've also seen that Russia has contributed to sending Syrians who are coming from the civil war and flooding into Europe and blaming that on local politicians. All of this is a strategy to get right-leaning nationalist candidates elected. So, is Russia winning globally? It depends on how we define the war. If we refer to it only as being Ukraine, Russia's certainly not winning. But if we look globally, is Russia getting closer to its objectives? Is Russia and its allies able to do more now than they could a year ago? It would certainly seem so. And more to that, Russia's goal has been very clear. Disinformation, propaganda, and other resources like this do not cause military confrontation. For Russia, being smart enough to recognize that the terrain that we would like to fight on, the West, is not a good one. To have a conventional war with NATO is something that Russia cannot do. So it must choose the terrain. And the terrain that Moscow has chosen is the terrain of the information space. By being able to persuade citizens to vote against their own country's interest, or being able to manipulate the internal politics of those countries, Russia can effectively get what it wants without risking its own soldiers' lives and risking the chance that NATO would actually take action against it. Russia realizes it can manipulate the elections as much as it wants, and it can do whatever it wants as far as propaganda goes. But the red line, don't attack cities that are under NATO. But Russia has no intention of attacking these cities. Russia's intention is to convince people in the European cities and the US and Canada to be doing things that are against their own interest, thus allowing Russia to never have to use its military. The terrain of the information space, the asymmetrical warfare that Russia is waging against the West today, is something that Russia has planned for years and years. But unfortunately, Western leaders have been very slow to react. In fact, they just seem to be afraid to confront Russia. And as a result, Vladimir Putin, being the bully that he is, meets no resistance, and so he responds with more force. It is key that right now, Western leaders take seriously the threat that Russia and its allies, like North Korea, Iran, and China, pose to our security. Because this is the first chapter of a much, much bigger war. Thank you.